The definition is that literacy students are not able to read and write in their own language or have an education that stopped around grade 8 or before grade 8.
For the illiterate people are those who are hopeless. They have no knowledge of nothing, no interest in life, no skills to help them work their ways out in everyday life.
People used to define it as just the ability to read and write, but some people, and they would like test people on that, like they know how they read or their ability to read certain words and understand them out of context, which is, I don't think it's reasonable. But some people they do know how to read and write, but they don't know how to cope up with life, like with everyday literacy demands.
I associated in my head literacy and fluency, and I think I still do a little bit. I recognize now the distinction because literacy, at least in the terms that we're using it now, is very focused on reading and writing from a teaching point of view. And that's sort of the basic definition of literacy, the ability to interact with the orthographic system of a language.
I think it's a really sort of a fluid concept, and it depends, I think, to a great extent on what a person's needs are. I think somebody who needs to be able to follow signs and to be able to use an ATM and do certain sort of routine acts like that as part of everyday life and can do them is a literate person, just as much as somebody who, teaches medieval literature here at the university.
There are a lot of students from either Iraq, Afghanistan, those countries. Usually the European students we used to see never had literacy problems. They were always completed their high school and often had post-secondary degrees. So countries where they're in a state of war or some kind of civil unrest, it's often, and some African countries too, where that's happening, it's often the children won't be able to get to class every day or will miss chunks of their learning or will only go up to a certain grade because either they have to help out in the household or the war is keeping them from going to class. Often the women suffer more than the men because the families will choose the boys to go to school because they feel that the boys should have an education to get a job and bring the money, and the women can still work at home and survive in a domestic environment. So you get a different type of student from different economic backgrounds, and usually from third world countries where school is not so accessible. They have to travel far, or there's other issues.
Mon expérience, j'ai pas beaucoup de, tu sais, en Haïti, un jour on va à l'école, un jour on va pas. Il n'y a jamais de bonne, enfin on pourrait aller, mais c'est pas tellement évident, quoi. Des fois, on n'a pas de professeur, on a, enfin.
Alors le système n'est pas
système,
vraiment.
Voilà. Des fois on a des cours, des fois il y a toujours beaucoup d'histoires en Haïti. Des fois il n'y a pas d'école, des fois il y a beaucoup, enfin, tu sais quoi, il y a trop de soucis, trop de problèmes et puis.
When you are older, it's not, you don't have necessarily that, I guess the word would be plasticity or that sort of flexibility to be able to readily absorb difficult stuff like literacy.
Mm-hmm.
To compound that, students who are adults and who have literacy issues have quite often, because they've come from backgrounds where quite often very few people are literate, it's hard for them to see how literacy operates and how it works, what it really is, and in a sense what the benefits are. At the same time, they've often developed strategies for coping without having literacy. So it's just one sort of layer of challenge after another.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that happens too, we often think of literacy students in ESL classes as being beginner level, but that's not always the case. It's often the case that these students actually do have speaking and listening skills, and they're often very adept at acquiring a second language through listening and speaking and through experience, right? But what happens in regular ESL classes is you get words on paper, right? And a certain type of analysis of language that is really, really, really hard for them.
Je voulais apprendre appris tout, des emails, de communiquer avec les gens en anglais correctement comme tout le monde. Ça, j'ai hâte de savoir tout ça. Mais j'espère que A, c'est E. On dit I, c'est I. Non, bon, avec le temps, je peux faire une phrase avec ça. Mais je travaille là-dessus. J'espère que je vais arriver un jour. C'est la même chose. J'ai tout. Là. Les familles. Big, large, small. Tout ça.
Ça, j'ai fait.
Expectations had to be very low about what they can take in. So we're talking about single word vocabulary, very small sets, just a set of body parts that are associated with illness and the collocations that go with them. Activities have to be very, very broken down into very simple components, and a lot of review, because they're acquiring new vocabulary in a language that's still new to them. With another group of high sort of link level or high literacy, you provide them a new word, you tell them a couple times, make sure they say it right, and they'll probably take it in. Maybe they'll have to ask again what it is, but they will ask, because they're filling in gaps at that point. Whereas in this group, we're creating the whole structure, the whole scaffolding of what their language is to be as it goes along, which means that you have to be very careful about how you do it and what expectations you put on. It has to be very simple, approachable tasks that are quick enough to accomplish fairly easily, but are also useful in day-to-day life.
So they would copy the words, and then they'd progress to having the fill in the blanks. So they would have missing letters, and they'd have to fill them in.
Okay.
And then they would put them into a simple sentence, and then we do the whole thing again. So in different formats. So it's very repetitive, and that's why she has all these.
Yeah. Like big pictures.
Different teachers have different approaches. I used to use this, and then you'd write a story, and you write it in big letters, and then repeat it again and repeat it again. So you would have the story, then I would give them a fill in the blanks, and they'd have to put the words in. And then I would give them another exercise with those words in different sentences, and see how far you can push them, and see how far they can stretch the meaning.
La première fois que je suis venue ici, j'ai inscrit dans une salle de l'école à côté, là, derrière. Mais j'ai resté pas longtemps parce que c'était trop difficile pour moi, parce que les gens, ils parlent anglais normalement. Mais moi, je restais là, immobile, je comprends rien du tout. Et la dame, il voulait pas que je parle en français. Parce qu'il me dit, bon, écoute, tu sais parler français, tu viens ici pour apprendre anglais. Normalement, il faut que tu parles en anglais. J'ai dit, mais c'est impossible, je fais pas. Je comprends rien, j'ai jamais entendu parler anglais. Comment tu veux que je parle anglais? Bon, je restais là, j'écoute les gens qui parlent, mais ça rentre pas du tout, je comprends pas.
I think one thing that often happens is that people feel a need to try to deal with the language from the bottom up. In other words, they want to start with ABC, and they want to build up from there and sort of deal with it as if it's as if there's a sort of a linear way of acquiring literacy, and that you have to start with the smaller pieces, which is the letters and the sounds and that type of thing. I think that's a long, painful process, and I think it's really dangerous that you can lose students that way. As I said earlier, I think students' needs are often quite here and now and quite immediate. Dealing with it in such a, albeit sort of systematic, linear way can, I think, really deter students from seeing the value of what's happening in the class. Better, I think, is to go in a more sort of top-down way and help students with literacy in a much broader sense, right? To be able to see a form, a text, a document, to see what it is, to be able to categorize it to begin with based on certain cues that may not have anything to do with A, B, C, D, E, F and the sound symbol correlation and those types of things. So I think it's important to sort of mix all those types of things up. I think we still have this sort of, maybe it dates back to our own, the way that we learn to be literate in our own first languages or whatever, but we have a desire to want to teach the system, which is kind of sometimes really dangerous because that's how we lose people, especially people who've never been in school before, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Too much analysis will kill people who have never analyzed things before.
On a acheté des choses, alors on voulait dire écoute, ça me plaît pas, je voulais la rendre. Mais il dit bon, comment je vais faire pour aller au magasin? Comment je lui ai dit? Comment je voulais expliquer? Je voulais changer. Bon ben, c'est là des fois ça nous perturbe un peu. Quand des fois on n'arrive pas à expliquer qu'est-ce qu'on voulait vraiment, qu'est-ce qu'on peut dire, qu'est-ce qu'on peut raconter. On dit peut-être les gens vont nous prendre pour des fous. C'est ça qui est très, des fois, qui nous perturbe, mais sinon.
We swim in a sea of reading and writing all the time. Or we should be. At least anyway, we assume that we are. That I assume that you guys are. But with these students, they're coming from a totally different perspective on a lot of things. And they may not even be conscious of a lot of things in their environment, you know, that are, in a broad sense, literacy, or that require literacy. And one way of dealing with it, I think, is to sort of bring those things into, help to bring those things into focus for them.
Je dis, écoute, je ne vais pas décourager, je continue. Des fois aussi, je lis tout seul. Des fois, quand je voulais aller quelque part, je prends quelques mots. Je fais mes petites courses, mes petites affaires, et puis voilà.
Tu t'arranges.
Yeah.
Oui.
Je m'arrange un peu.
Oui.
Il faut toujours essayer. Toujours dire, bon, écoute, je vais faire ça. Si ça marche pas, tant pis, mais on essaie quand même.
I'm very fortunate in my life to have had access to not only technologies but the wealth of a country that's doing fairly well in the long run, and a higher education. Even if I am going into debt to do it, the fact that I have an opportunity to go into debt to get an education is an advantage over other people. But at the same time, I have to eat. I have to sleep. I have to find shelter. I would like to find a companion in life. And that really doesn't change much. How we go about it does. And that's the cultural part. But everything else is very human. So everyone's a teacher and everyone's a student sometime in their life. And that dynamic can be very, very universal. Everyone that I encounter has something to teach me and can show me something that I didn't know, even if it's simply a perspective of the world that I wasn't exposed to because they come from a different place. And I have the same thing to offer. I have a perspective on the world that they've entered because I'm familiar with it. But I don't think that distance exists unless we make it, because there's people here who are immigrants, who are my professors, who are not necessarily as fluent in English as I am, but are fluent enough to exist in academia and be successful. And they, at one point, were people who didn't speak English and didn't really know the cultural stuff. So it's the distance only exists if you believe that it's insurmountable. But if you accept that it's not, and the purpose of what we're doing is to help people and work with them so that they surmount it, if that's the goal, then there is no difference. It's just, it's the same as every other teacher and every other student. If I wanted to learn how to cook something that they know, I know nothing at the beginning, and they accept that I know nothing, but they accept that I will know at the end how to do it. And it's the same way. We're just both people trying to learn how to exist.